Hello. It seems like the late 80s and early 90s have a never-ending resource of fun F1 reject stories to tell. From the AGS Garage Band to Onyx's Less Than Kosher Money to whatever the hell Life Racing Engines was supposed to be, F1 was the Wild West after the turbo ban. The minnows of the post-turbo era had varying levels of promise, but almost all of them ended up failing, with the exception of Minardi. One of the more promising outfits that had their go in the pinnacle of European motorsports was Coloni Racing Systems, and this is their story. The Wolf, Enzo Coloni, was a racer himself from the early 70s to the early 80s, sticking around the Italian F3 championship for his entire career. He retired from racing after winning the F3 championship in 1982 and became a team owner, setting up his team in his hometown of Perugia. The Wolf branding would follow him around for the rest of his days. Coloni encountered almost immediate success in Italian F3. His first subject was Ivan Capelli, who ran away with the Italian F3 title in 1983. In 1984, Alessandro Santin repeated Ivan's feat at the domestic level, and Ivan himself would win the international F3 championship in Coloni equipment. In 1985, Alex Caffey would finish a close second to Franco Ferrini, but in '86, Nicola Larini took the Italian F3 title home. '86 was also the year that Coloni took its first steps into International Formula 3000, fielding two cars for Gabriele Tarquini, who finished the season P10 in the points, and a revolving door of Forini, Santin, Larini, Guido Dacco, and Nicola Tassini. It had only been 4 seasons, but Perugia was shaping up to be title town. It was obvious that Wolfman had a hell of an eye for talent, and he could extract the very best out of his customer equipment. After having won almost everything there is to win in the lower formula, Enzo then began to look upwards, towards Formula 1. Enzo curtailed everything except the Italian F3 program for 1987, and in the background his boys started working on an F1 chassis. Now, the boys in Perugia were smart enough to ease their way into Formula 1 instead of just jumping in face first. They took their time on construction, and got their 1987 chassis done before the end of the season, the FC187, one of the last cars to be built with an open engine bay, fun fact. Scuderia Coloni made its first Formula 1 appearance at the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Nicola Larini tried his damnedest, but a car that didn't have a turbo just stood no chance at this time. At Jerez, a less power-dependent track, Larini put Coloni on the grid for the first time ever, qualifying 26th and last on the grid by 1/10 over Alex Caffey's Acela, but a rear suspension brake would end their day after just 8 laps. All in all, a solid debut. They proved that they could make a Formula 1 grid, but 1988 would be the real test. Could Coloni do a full season? Coloni's 1988 would be a new beginning, but also a lot of the same. Not many upgrades were put onto the FC188. Aside from a more aerodynamic nose cone and an engine cover, it was basically the same car. Gabriele Tarquini would lead the charge for the one-car operation and would actually put the car in the field for the first 3 races. The season opener at Jacare Pagua would end on lap 36 after a suspension failure. San Marino would find the yellow car as high as 13th before a fuel line failure on lap 31, and Monaco would end after just 5 laps due to another suspension failure. Tarquini's first finish in a Coloni would come at round 4 in Mexico City, where he finished in P14, 5 laps down. He wouldn't finish again until Canada, where he brought it home in a stunning 8th place. That would be worth a few points today, but back then, no dice. One hell of a day for a team of their stature, but ultimately not a fruitful one on the scoreboard. Coloni upped their staff midway through 1988, taking advantage of an exodus of staff from AGS to snatch up Christian Vanderplein, Michel Costa, and Frederic Dino to be their head designer, R&D specialist, and team principal respectively. This wouldn't save them on track in '88, however. After the 8th place at Imola, they cratered. 4 consecutive DNPQs from Detroit to Hockenheim, last of the remaining finishers at the Hungaroring, a non-classification at Spa, and an 11th place at Estoril would bookend their unassuming second season. Their futility got to a point where, allegedly, Riccardo Patrese and Alessandro Nannini would essentially just straight up tell Tarquini what the gear ratios they were running so that Coloni could actually be competitive. They would need, and ultimately get, a lot of help for 1989. With the combined expertise of Costa and Vanderplein, Coloni would roll out with a revised C188 called the C188B, while in the background they were building an entirely new car to be revealed and debuted later on in the season. They would also expand to a two-car operation. One car would be piloted by Reject Jesus Roberto Moreno, and the other would be driven by rookie Frenchman Pierre-Henri Raffanel, who can best be described as one of the race car drivers of all time. Of all the drivers to have made a Formula One appearance, he was definitely one of them. I can confirm, he did exist. If Moreno was the talent, then PHR was the cash. He had a full season of backing from the television channel La Cinq, or Channel 5, the French branch of the Mediaset television empire headed up by Silvio Berlusconi. There were revisions made to the C188B, but it was still very old equipment. Powered by an asthmatic Cosworth DFR, Pupo and PHR failed to make it into the show at Jacare-Pagua and Imola, but at Monaco, they performed a miracle. Raffanel cleared Friday morning, and then stuck his car in a monumental 17th place, ahead of names like Piquet, Arnoux, and Herbert. Moreno would make the grid as well in P25, marking the first and ultimately only time in the team's history that both cars would make the grid simultaneously. Both cars would ultimately tap out early with faulty gearboxes, but the day was still a massive success. Too bad it ended up being the peak of the year. The cars would at least show up at Mexico City and Phoenix, but they were more preoccupied with finishing the belated new car, dubbed the C3. The new car would debut at Montreal, and while Raffanel would fail to pre-qualify, Moreno would sneak onto the grid by .014 seconds over Satoru Nakajima and Lotus. Moreno would end up being the last car to retire, being scored in 9th. Again, that's a points finish in the present day, but not at the time. Pupo would DNQ at Paul Ricard the next weekend, but then make the grid at Silverstone, again failing to finish. Because the car was so late, they were desperately behind on upgrades and revisions, so they would eventually fall off the face of the map. After Monaco, PHR would never again escape pre-qualifying, and would end up leaving the team on his own volition, and be replaced after Hungary by a debuting Enrico Bertaggia, who wouldn't fare much better. Moreno would make one last start at Estoril, qualifying in an impressive 15th, but ultimately being scored in dead last after electrical problems on lap 12. Behind the scenes, there had been a massive exodus of staff, including Vanderplein, which left the team with just 6 mechanics on staff. Not 66, not 60, not even 16. Just 6. There are still a lot of growing pains, but at least there's something to be built off here. At least, you'd think that. But then 1990 happened. The best bit of news going into 1990 was that Coloni was going to get some factory support from a big-name car company. The bad news reveals itself as soon as you even read halfway into it. Subaru had gotten the itch to go F1 racing after seeing what Honda and Yamaha had been up to, so they offered up their services to whoever was open. They first stepped up to Minardi, but Minardi said no. That opened the door for Coloni, and Subaru bought out 50% of Enzo Coloni's stake in the team, implemented a Subaru employee and former rally driver as the new team boss, hired a former Onyx designer as the czar of car design, and hired Mr. Worldwide Bertrand Gachot to be their one driver. They no longer had the funds to run 2 cars. This all seems up to board, doesn't it? I'm leaving out a very important piece to the puzzle. What's powering the cars now? Well... Every time I read more into this f***ing Omni-Shambles, the more I laugh, so this is now an impromptu episode of Funny Cars. Subaru had struck a deal with Carlo Citti, the founder and lead engineer from Motori Moderni, who longtime viewers who were particularly astute would remember as the folks that supplied turbocharged V6s to AGS when they were first starting out. Now that turbochargers were banned, Motori Moderni had to build a new engine, and let's say they did some out-of-the-box thinking. Coloni rocked up to the preseason shakedowns with a modified C3 powered by a 12-cylinder boxer engine. The flat-cylinder layout had not been used in Formula One since 1980, but Citti decided that a full decade later that it was high time the boxer made a comeback. By itself, the Subaru 1235 structure was comparable in weight to a fully assembled Cosworth V8. But that was just the engine block itself. If you were to connect all of the electronics and other auxiliary parts to it, it would end up weighing a whopping 112 kilograms more than the Cosworth. Citti claimed that the flat 12 would provide an aerodynamic advantage because the center of gravity is so low. But a low center of gravity doesn't mean anything when the entire engine structure weighs more than Zach Brown. This thing must have handled like a goddamn cruise ship. Okay, so the weight is suboptimal, but a 12-cylinder engine was good for a ton of power, right? Well, dyno readings stated that it only put out 560 horsepower. That's about 30 less than the Cosworth DFR from last season, an engine that had 4 less cylinders. So not only was this hunk of junk fat, but it was also weak. This is gonna go just fantastically, isn't it? Due to just how crappily planned and crappily built the C3B was, it would never run for too long before breaking down. I shouldn't have to tell you that Gasho did not make it out of pre-qualifying a single time between the season opener in Phoenix and Silverstone, after which Subaru officially pulled out and sold their share in the team back to Enzo Coloni. The flat 12 was then replaced with a Cosworth DFR, and fortunes then immediately improved. Gasho still didn't make it to any races throughout the rest of the season, but he did escape Friday morning more times than not between Hockenheim and the season finale in Adelaide. Finances were dire, and not a single start in 1990 was a very bad sign, but miraculously Coloni mustered the funds to come back for 1991. Coloni trudged into the new year with the new C4, bit on the nose to name your car after an explosive, which was not penned by a single person, but by engineering students at Enzo's alma mater, the University of Perugia. I don't know about you, but that sounds like the best class project ever. Imagine Cadillac turning to the engineering students at Indiana University and asking them to design their F1 ride. That would be mental. They hired Portuguese pay driver Pedro Chavez to pilot this speedboat for the season. Predictably, they were awful. They didn't once escape pre-qualifying, but valiantly they continued to show up and set laps. Chavez would end up leaving the team after his cash reserves dried up, and Coloni would not participate in the Spanish Grand Prix at Jerez. Salvation would be found in the form of reigning Japanese Formula 3 champion Naoki Hattori, who proposed an interesting style of funding: a subscription service. For a fee of $250 American, fans of Hattori could get their name on the side pod of the car. For my American audience, or for those that are familiar with NASCAR, I would liken this to the thing that Joe Gibbs Racing did in about 2013 at Dover in conjunction with Autism Speaks. As revolutionary and as odd as the funding was, it did get them to the flyaway races at Suzuka and Adelaide, where Hattori would fail to pre-qualify both times. Despite their struggles, they did end up making it all the way, coast to coast, beginning to end, on a shoestring budget and raw, unfiltered chutzpah, and that is worthy of commendation. But unfortunately, the state the Coloni was left in meant that the only way the team could stay afloat was a total buyout. So the dream for Enzo Coloni was essentially dead. The Coloni team would get its buyout from a place that no sane man expected. Enzo let his team be sold for about $6 million to a shoe salesman from Marche by the name of Andrea Sassetti. Now, if you've been around the F1 YouTube scene for any longer than, say, 6 hours, you're probably familiar with the name Andrea Motta. I can hear the calls for a video now, and let me get it out of the way. I do not intend to make a video on Andrea Motta Formula. The subject has been done to death and done better by the likes of Aiden Millward and Josh Revel. I would recommend going over to those videos for your Andrea Motta history lesson. Enzo Coloni would stick around the racing world, retreating back to the lower Formula scene. They restarted in International F3 before graduating back up to F3000, which would later become GP2 in 1997. They would stick around the GP2 scene until 2012 as a midfield outfit, fielding future stars such as Matias Lauda, Alvaro Parente, Antonio Pizzonia, Giorgio Pantano, James Jakes, Brendan Hartley, and Luca Filippi. Enzo himself is still kicking around at the age of 79, and his son Paolo runs a team at the club level and acts as a coach for some F4 teams. Nicola Larini and Gabriele Tarquini lived very intertwined racing lives. Larini would move on to Asella, Ligier, Lamborghini Modena, and a role as Ferrari's reserve driver through the end of Coloni's lifetime in F1 in '92. Tarquini was linked to the first racing startup led by Lamberto Leoni in 1989, but that team would famously never make a race after building a car that better resembled an instrument of torture used by the Spanish Inquisition. Tarquini would then make some appearances with AGS and Fon Metal before officially washing out of the sport in 1991. Both men would find themselves at Alfa Romeo, piloting their cars used in the touring car ranks. Both Larini and Tarquini are hailed as two of the best touring car drivers to ever live. Pierre-Henri Raffanel would end up becoming a factory driver for Toyota after leaving Coloni, and would prove to be quite the endurance racer. He won his class at Le Mans in 1997, driving the famous McLaren F1 in conjunction with Jean-Marc Gounon and Anders Olafsson. Raffanel would also be tasked with taking the Bugatti Veyron to its limits in 2010, putting up a personal best straight-line speed of 267 miles per hour. Enrico Bertaggio would be involved with the Andrea Motta fiasco very briefly, and after his F1 days would then bounce around the Italian domestic scene. In 1995, he drove a Callaway Corvette at Le Mans alongside Johnny Unser and Frank Jelinski, and finished second in the GT2 class, 9th outright. He is now a full-time driver coach. Pedro Chavez was linked to Leighton House for the 1992 season after escaping Coloni, but after funds didn't turn up, he was turned down and replaced with Karl Wendlinger. He would then turn up pretty much everywhere they allowed him to race, from F3000 to the sports car scene, even to Indy Lights. He retired from racing in 2006. Naoki Hattori would become a local legend in his homeland of Japan, becoming a multi-time Japanese touring car champion. He finished runner-up in Super GT in 1996, and he would finish runner-up several times in Formula Nippon. And so that is the story of Coloni Racing Systems. While it had some funny moments, it was an earnest attempt at becoming an international racing institution by a good man with good intentions. While Coloni may have been the least successful team in F1 history statistically, you can't fault their bravery, tenacity, and grit. Alright, that's it from me. I have been Bobcat205, and thank you for watching. See you next time!